Hey folks, in this episode we're going to be making this Geometry Nodes audio visualizer here. So this is a continuation from my previous tutorial, Dynamic Proximity Node Hack. You can download the project file for free from my Patreon. I'll leave a link to that tutorial and the project file in the description. Once you've followed that tutorial, or you've downloaded the project file, you should be left with this Blender project here. So the first thing to do in this Blender project file is we go to Output, and we're just going to ensure that we've got a frame rate of 30 frames per second. I'm going to be working with a beat that's 150 beats per minute, aka 150 BPM. So we need to calculate how many frames per beat we get with a frame rate of 30 frames per second. I'm going to use this BPM to FPS calculator. So we know that we're running at 30 frames per second and the beats per minute are going to be 150 beats per minute. I'll then click solve. So that gives us 12 frames per beat. So 2 beats will be 24, 4 beats will be 48. You don't have to use the VJam calculator. You can use any BPM to FPS calculator. So now that I know we've got 12 frames per beat, I'm going to close this window. In here, I'm going to type in 48 because we want 4 beats, and we'll times that by 8, and that gives us 384. So I'm going to set my end frame to 384. I'm just going to skip back to frame 1 for now. With my geometry node object selected, I'm going to go into my geometry node editor. I'm going to identify this subdivision surface. I'm going to hit M to mute, and that will improve viewport performance. Now I need a way to get the audio data into Blender. So I'm just going to go into solid view. I'll hit Shift C, and that will recenter my cursor to the world. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to go empty, and I'm going to choose single arrow. I'll then navigate to my empty data tab down here, and I'm going to set the scale to 4. In my outliner, I'm going to rename the empty to frequency low. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll escape it back in its original position. And I'll go to my outliner, and I'm going to rename this object to frequency high. In my outliner, I'm going to select the frequency low object. I'll navigate to my shader editor over here, and I'll change it from the shader editor to the graph editor. I'll then hit N to hide the N panel. I'll navigate to my object data tab over here, and with my active frame set to frame 1 and the Z location set to 0, I'm going to add a keyframe here. I'll then select the frequency high empty object. I'll navigate to the object data tab over here, and with the Z location set to 0, I'm going to add a keyframe here as well. I'll then select frequency low in my outliner. I'm going to navigate to my graph editor. I'll expand these options. I'll expand the object transform, and I'll select the Z location. I'll then click channel. I'll navigate to where it says sound to samples. I'm going to use this audio sample for now. This is my own beat I made with my Akai MPC. I'll leave a link to this in the description where you can download it for free from my Patreon, or alternatively you can use your own audio. With these settings down here, we only want to bake in the low frequencies for this sample because it's on the frequency low empty object. I made this audio frequency infograph for this tutorial and for some up and coming tutorials just as a reference. The frequency range we're going to bake in for the low end will be between 20 Hz and 60 Hz. So I'll just move this over here. So for the low frequency we're going to type in 20, and for the highest frequency we're going to type in 60. I'll then click sound to samples, and now we've baked in all the low end data. Excellent. I'll then navigate to my outliner and I'll select frequency high. I'll then navigate back to the graph editor. I'll expand these options, expand the object transform, select your Z location. We'll then go to channel and we'll select sound to samples. So for the high end frequencies, we're going to choose a frequency range between 4000 kHz and 20,000 kHz. So for the lowest frequency, we're going to type in 4000, and the highest frequency, we're going to type in 20,000. I'll then select ptitle 150 bpm.wave. I'll then click sound to samples, and now we've captured all the high end frequencies. In the 3D viewport, I'll hit numpad 0 to go into camera view, and now if I was to hit play, we wouldn't hear any audio because we haven't got any audio in the actual scene itself. We've only got the curves baked into the graph editor. So I'm just going to skip back to frame 1. I'm going to click into empty space so I've got nothing selected. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to go speaker. I'm going to ensure I've got the speaker selected in my outliner. I'll then navigate to the audio data tab. I'll then click open. I'll select the audio sample here. I'll click open sound mono. And now if I hit play, you should hear the beat. Excellent. I'll navigate to the graph editor, and I'm going to change this from the graph editor to the shader editor. I'll then select the geometry nodes object. Maybe will give us a bit more room in the geometry node section. And in your geometry node tree, this is what we've got so far. And now I need to get the frequency low and high data into geometry nodes. So I'm going to drag the frequency low empty object into the geometry node editor. And I'll do the same for frequency high. So these empty objects are animating on the z-axis. And that means we can use the Z location data on those empty objects for the low and high frequencies to drive certain parameters in geometry nodes. I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go Utilities, we'll go Vector, and we'll choose Separate XYZ. Shift A, go Utilities, Math, and we choose Math. Shift A, I'm going to go Texture, and we'll choose Noise Texture. I'll change the noise texture from 3D to 4D. I'm going to set the detail to 0. I'm just going to increase the size of these object infos, and that's so we can see whether the frequency is high or low. I'll then connect the location socket from the frequency low into the vector of the separate XYZ, and the Z socket from the separate XYZ into the top socket of the math node. And on the math node, which is set to add, I'm going to set the value to 1. I'll then box select these two nodes. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop these down here. I'll then connect this location socket from the high frequency into the vector of the separate XYZ. I'll just box select all of these nodes here. I'm going to hit G, and I'm just going to bring them up to around about there. And now on this map range node, which is the controller for the proximity empty object, the 2 minimum value increases the offset scale of the extrude node. And so we're going to plug this factor from the noise texture into the 2 minimum. I'll just decrease the scale on the noise texture to 2 for now. And now, if I was to change this W factor, you can see that the noise pattern is changing in the 3D viewport up here. And it's the same with the scale. We can change the frequency of the noise pattern. So I'm going to take the value from this math node and plug it into the W factor of the noise texture. So the low frequencies are going to be controlling the W factor. And for the high frequencies, we're going to plug this into the scale. And now, if I hit play, you can see that the noise texture is being driven by the high and low frequencies, which is driving the offset scale of the extrude mesh. Excellent. So I guess the next step is to bring that audio frequency data into the shader editor. And we can do that with a store named attribute. So I'm going to take this store named attribute node. I'm going to hit Shift D, and I'm going to pop it in between there. I'll then just drag it down. I'll hit Shift D one more time and pop this in between there, and I'll drag this down. For this store named attribute, I'm going to rename the attribute to FL for frequency low, and for this store named attribute, I'm going to rename the attribute to FH for frequency high. So the value we want for frequency low will come from the frequency low object info over here, and we're just going to plug this Z value directly into the value of the store named attribute for frequency low. And for the frequency high store named attribute, we're going to do exactly the same for the high frequency empty object. So I'm going to take this Z value and plug it directly into the value of this store named attribute named frequency high. If we were to use these attribute masks in the shader editor, the entire object would glow up. So I'm just going to go into rendered view quick. I'm going to select my subdivision surface. I'm going to hit M to unmute. And you can see we've got these gold rings around the edges here, and they're driven by these top and side faces. So I don't want these store named attribute masks to affect the entire mesh. I just want them to affect the rims of these top faces. So we need to use these top and side sockets plugged into these selection sockets of the store named attributes. So I want these face edges to have an emission value, and I don't want the whole object to have an emission value. So in order to do that, I'll just hit Shift A. I'm going to go Utilities, we'll go Math, and I'll choose Math. I'll then change it from Add to Multiply, and we'll multiply this top face socket with this side face socket. I can now use this value socket and plug it into the selection sockets of these store named attribute nodes. So the two attributes we have to remember is FL and FH for frequency low and frequency high. So we can now move in to the shader editor. So the first thing I'll do, I'm going to select this color ramp. I'm going to select the white flag, and I'll set the position to 0.75. And all that's done is made these edges a bit thinner, and that gives us a bit more room for emission. So if I drag this flag, you can see it gets thicker or thinner. I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go Input, and I'll choose Attribute. I'll pop that there. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop that down here. For this top attribute, we're going to rename this to FL for frequency low, which is the same as the attribute in our geometry nodes here. And for this bottom attribute, I'm going to rename this to frequency high, and that will call up this frequency high store named attribute. On my principal BSDF, I'm going to expand the emission options. I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go converter, and I'll choose color ramp, and I'll pop that there. I'll hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop that down here. I'll connect the factor from the frequency low attribute into the factor of the color ramp. I'll then connect the color from the color ramp into the strength of the emission socket of the principal BSDF. On the color ramp, I'm going to change the interpolation type from linear to ease. I'm going to select the white flag. I'll then go to the white flag swatch, and I'm going to increase the value to 10. And the value number here on hue saturation value, this controls the strength of the emission. For this color ramp, I'm going to click the plus button. I'll click it one more time. I'll select this flag, and I'll click the plus button one more time. For the first flag, I'm going to set this to a green color, maybe something around there perhaps. For the second flag, I'm going to set this to blue. For the third flag, I'm going to set this to pink. For the fourth flag, I'm going to set this to red. And finally, for the last flag, I'm going to set this to orange, maybe something around there. I'll then drag the blue flag all the way across over to here. I'll drag the pink flag all the way across, the red flag, and the orange flag. I'll then connect the factor from the frequency high attribute into the factor of the color ramp, and the color from the color ramp into the color of the principal BSDF. I'll just skip back to frame 1. I'm going to skip forward a couple of frames. I'm going to keep skipping forward. Okay, I want to play this back in real time, so I'm just going to increase my geometry node window. I'm going to go to the subdivision surface. I'll select that. I'm going to hit M to mute. I'll then navigate into material preview. I'll then hit play, and I'm just checking that the colors are changing with the high frequency. So the emission strength is being driven by the low frequencies, and the color changes is being driven by the high frequencies. If I continue to play, it's going to stop rotating. And that's because the animation for the rotate empty was animated over 240 frames. So in my outliner, I'm going to select my rotate empty object. I'll just increase my timeline. You can see that it ends on frame 241. So I want to skip to the last frame. I'm going to skip forward one more frame. So we're on frame 385. I'm going to go to my object data tab over here, and I'm going to add keyframes for the X and Z rotation. I'll then box select the middle keyframe here. I'm going to hit X, and we'll delete the keyframes. So now this rotate empty object should rotate 360 degrees throughout the entirety of the animation. Excellent. I'll just select the geometry node object. I'm going to go to my subdivision surface. I'm going to hit M to unmute that. I'm going to go to frame 4. I'll then navigate to my compositing tab over here. I'm going to enable use nodes, and with your end panel open, we're going to go to view. Just ensure that you've got backdrop enabled. I'll go to my layout. It's a good idea to save your project, so I'm going to go to file, save as, and I'm going to save my project as like and subscribe, you legend, and then click save as. I'll just go to my render settings over here. So I'm using cycles. I've got GPU compute enabled. I've got a noise threshold of 0.25, max samples of 2048, and I've disabled reflective and refractive caustics. To be honest, you probably don't need this many samples. You could probably get away with 256 or 512, but I'm going with these settings for now. So we can render it like this, but if you go to your geometry nodes window and go to your icosphere, which is the first object in the chain, you can increase your subdivisions, and that will give you more extrusions. For my render, I'm just going to set this to 2. I'll then hit F12 just to render out a test frame. When that's finished rendering, we're going to close this window. We'll then open the compositing tab up here in the end panel. I'm going to click fit. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to go filter, and I'll choose glare, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll change it from streaks to bloom, and I'll decrease the size to 0.1. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to go color. We'll go mix, and we'll choose alpha over, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then connect the image from the render layers into the bottom socket of the alpha over. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to go filter, and I'll choose sunbeams, and I'll pop that in between the render layers and the alpha over. I'll then reduce the factor on the alpha over to 0.2. You could animate this alpha over to increase in intensity and decrease in intensity, and to enhance it a bit more, you could also add a lens distortion. So Shift A, we go transform, and we'll choose lens distortion, and I'll pop that there. You could then animate the dispersion. So I'm just going to take this sunbeams node. I'm going to hit M to mute, and that will speed things up a little bit. So maybe I want to animate this lens distortion dispersion on the beginning of the first bar and the beginning of the 8th bar. So with my timeline set to frame 1, I'm going to set the dispersion on the lens distortion to 0.2. I'll then hit I to add a keyframe. I'll then skip forward 10 frames, so we're on frame 10. I'll then set the dispersion to 0. I'll hit I, and on my current frame, I'm going to set this to 48 times 4, and that will give us a value of 192. I'll skip back 1 frame, so we're on frame 191. With the dispersion set to 0, I'm going to hit I. I'll skip forward 1 frame, so we're on frame 192. I'll then set the dispersion to 0.2. I'll hit I to add a keyframe. I'm going to skip forward 10 frames. I'll then set the dispersion to 0. I'll add a keyframe there. I'm just going to skip to the last frame, and with the dispersion set to 0, I'm going to also add a keyframe there. Maybe we can view this in the layout view. So I'm just going to go to my layout view over here. I'm just going to go into rendered view. And next to my render toggles up here, I'll click the arrow button, and for the compositor, I'm going to choose camera. And you can see we're getting the lens distortion dispersion here. And that should have run out by frame 10. I'll just navigate back to my compositing tab over here. And with the sunbeam selected, I'm going to hit M to unmute. I'll navigate back to my layout view. I'm going to go to my output tab over here. And under output, we're going to choose the file location where you want to save your image sequence, and then click accept. I'm going to choose the file format of PNG. Alternatively, you can go with a file format of OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA, and that will decrease your file size whilst increasing your dynamic range. But for now, I'm just going to go with PNG. I'll just go into Material Preview up here. I'm going to hit Ctrl S to save the project, and then it's simply a case of hitting Ctrl F12, and that will render out your image sequence. You can then take that image sequence into a video editor, whether it's Blender or DaVinci Resolve. You can then import your audio and then render it out as a complete video. Join me on Patreon as a free member to have access to this file alongside other Blender files from previous tutorials. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.